She inherited a burned-down house and dreamed of restoring it. But the children of a wealthy woman decided that she should not succeed. What she found behind the closed door changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Clarissa Johnson had long since grown used to the narrow corridors of struggle that defined her life. Every morning began with the sharp cry of the alarm clock and the dull ache in her legs from standing through long shifts at the hospice. Her small house on the edge of town was modest to the point of austerity. Second-hand curtains dulled by the sun, a kitchen table scarred with the marks of countless hurried meals, and the constant hum of the refrigerator reminding her that bills were never far behind. She lived with her 2 children, a teenage boy already carrying the weary defiance of someone who had learned too early about responsibility, and a younger girl who still clung to innocence, drawing pictures of houses with towers and gardens she had only ever seen in storybooks. Since the divorce, Clarissa had learned to count every coin. Clothes were bought second-hand, food, purchased with meticulous attention to discounts, and luxuries were nothing more than passing thoughts quickly dismissed. Yet despite the unrelenting tide of hardships, she carried herself with a quiet determination, reminding her children daily that integrity was worth more than any fleeting comfort. To her, survival was not only about keeping a roof over their heads, but about ensuring that her children never doubted her strength. At the hospice, her days were filled with tasks that demanded both precision and compassion. She distributed medication, adjusted blankets, cleaned rooms, and more importantly, listened. Many of the elderly who came there had long been abandoned by their families, and in those final stretches of life, it was the presence of a listening ear that gave them comfort. Clarissa gave herself to that role fully. It was in the act of listening that she found purpose, as if gathering the fragments of lives that would otherwise be forgotten was her silent mission. It was during one of those shifts that she met Eleanor Winters. Eleanor was nothing like the others in the hospice, where most arrived diminished, their voices already faint echoes. Eleanor carried the weight of her past wealth like a cloak she had never discarded. Even in illness, her posture bore remnants of elegance. Her speech was deliberate, her eyes sharp, her hands thin but manicured to the end. She had been the wife of a wealthy industrialist, a man whose name was etched on buildings and whose fortune had shaped much of the region's development decades before. But Eleanor was no longer surrounded by admirers. Her children, though alive and well, seldom visited, and when they did, their conversations rang hollow, dripping with impatience and veiled calculation. For weeks, Clarissa attended to her, at first keeping the quiet, professional distance she always maintained. But Eleanor was not a woman to be ignored, and gradually she began to draw Clarissa into her confidences. What started with small observations about the meals or the weather became fragments of her memories, fragments that hinted at a life of grandeur suffused with a deep loneliness. In the sterile white rooms of the hospice, Eleanor spoke of her estate perched on the cliffs above the sea, of gardens once alive with roses, of corridors lined with portraits and heavy velvet curtains. Yet her words often soured when she mentioned her children. There was a hardness in her voice, an old bitterness, as if she knew they were circling like vultures, eager for the day they would divide her fortune. What Clarissa never expected was the day when Eleanor grasped her hand and told her she feared being forgotten, not as a name on a plaque or a gravestone, but as a person who had lived and suffered. Clarissa listened, as she always did, but there was something about the old woman's gaze that suggested she had already made a decision. When Eleanor passed away, the hospice staff carried on with the routine rituals of death. Papers were signed, belongings boxed, and soon the room she had occupied was prepared for another occupant. Clarissa mourned quietly, Not with tears, but with the familiar ache that came from losing someone she had come to know in fragments. Life went on. Or so she thought. The news reached her days later. She was summoned to a lawyer's office, a place she entered with trembling hands and a mind full of confusion. Sitting in the heavy chair opposite the lawyer, she listened in stunned silence as the will was read. Eleanor Winters had left her estate, the house, the grounds, and even a portion of the fortune. Not to her children, but to Clarissa Johnson, the hospice nurse who had cared for her in her final months. The only stipulation written in firm script was that the estate could not be sold or destroyed. It was to be preserved. The shock rolled through Clarissa like a storm. She could barely comprehend what it meant. Her own house had peeling paint and a leaking roof, and now she was suddenly the owner of a mansion by the sea. But the enormity of the gift brought with it a sense of burden. She had not sought it, and she feared it would ignite resentment in those who believed the inheritance should have been theirs. The fears proved true almost immediately. Eleanor's children, Celia and Vincent, were enraged. The lawyer's office had scarcely finished its work before they began filing petitions, making calls, and hurling accusations. They told anyone who would listen that Clarissa had manipulated their mother, that she had preyed upon an old woman's loneliness. The whisper spread quickly. To the townspeople, the story of a poor nurse inheriting a fortune sounded like something out of a scandal sheet. Everywhere Clarissa went, she felt eyes upon her, weighing, judging, speculating. And yet, bound by the will, she could not sell the estate. She would have to face it. The first time she saw the house with her own eyes, she understood why people spoke of it in hushed tones. It stood on a high cliff, the ocean stretching endlessly behind it, waves crashing against jagged rocks. Once, it must have gleamed like a jewel, with its tall windows, sweeping staircases, and elegant lines. Now, it looked more like a ruin haunted by its past. A fire had torn through part of it years before, leaving walls blackened, beams exposed, and the scent of char lingering even after time had dulled its edges. The grounds were overgrown, weeds choking the gardens Eleanor had once described, statues cracked and moss-covered. Clarissa walked through its echoing halls with her children close by. The floors creaked beneath their weight, the wallpaper peeled in long strips, and the once grand chandeliers hung askew, their crystals dulled by soot. In some rooms, furniture remained, shrouded in dust and ash. The air felt heavy, as if it carried the sorrow of decades. The children were wide-eyed, caught between fear and fascination. An engineer who accompanied them was blunt in his assessment. The structure was compromised, repairs would be astronomical, and it would be far easier and cheaper to tear it down and build anew. Clarissa listened, but remained silent, her gaze drawn to the high ceilings and the remnants of beauty hidden beneath decay. She could almost hear Eleanor's voice in her memory, speaking of preservation, of remembrance. Selling or demolishing felt like betrayal, even if it seemed impossible to do otherwise. It was in the eastern wing, while wandering through a corridor blackened by fire, that Clarissa found it. A door, not of wood, but of heavy metal, set deep into the wall. The frame was sealed with bolts, and on its surface, nearly obscured by rust, were words stamped into a plaque. Sealed 1952. Do not open. The sight of it sent a chill through her. The fire had eaten away much of the wing, but this door had endured, stubborn and immovable. She placed her hand on the cold surface and felt, absurdly, that something within was waiting. The discovery unsettled her. She began to wonder if the fire had been an accident after all. The notion that someone had once gone to the effort of sealing an entire chamber marking it with a warning, suggested that the house was more than an inheritance. It was a vault of secrets. Clarissa, standing there in the dim corridor with her children behind her, understood that she had been left more than a burden of stone and ash. She had been left with a legacy that demanded courage to uncover. The sea roared outside the shattered windows, as if echoing her thoughts. She turned away from the door, but could not forget it. The words etched in metal clung to her mind like a shadow. And with them came the realization that the house was not merely a ruin to be repaired. It was a puzzle, and somewhere within its silence lay the truth of why Eleanor had chosen her, and not her own blood, to inherit it. The days following Clarissa's first visit to the estate unfolded like a slow descent into both awe and dread. The enormity of what she had inherited weighed upon her every waking hour. The house did not feel like a gift. It felt like an unfinished sentence that only she had been chosen to complete. Each time she thought of the blackened walls, the collapsed beams, and that sealed metal door in the east wing, she felt a tightening in her chest. It was as though Eleanor had deliberately handed her not only the keys to a decaying mansion, but also a task that would demand every ounce of her strength. The children, too, seemed to sense the gravity of it all. Her son, practical and cautious, worried aloud about money, while her daughter remained enthralled by the idea of towers and secret rooms, her imagination weaving the ruin into a fairy tale that Clarissa herself struggled to believe in. Money was the first and fiercest adversary. Clarissa had lived her life balancing one bill against another, making small sacrifices to keep afloat. But the costs of restoring a mansion were not the kind that could be met with sacrifices. They required sums she could not even imagine, much less command. She gathered every document, every savings account, every scrap of financial record she had, and tried to piece together a plan. The numbers glared back at her, impossible and cold. She went to the bank, dressed in her best clothes, heart hammering as she explained her new position as the owner of an estate. The banker listened politely, but shook his head. She had no steady income beyond her modest salary, no collateral strong enough to guarantee the scale of the loan required. Other institutions gave the same response, some with veiled condescension, others with frank dismissal. Determined not to give in, she sold her car, a modest vehicle she had relied upon for years, and took to walking or riding buses with her children. She clipped coupons with renewed vigor, eliminated even the smallest luxuries, and took extra shifts at the hospice, exhausting herself to the bone. Yet even with all these efforts, the money barely covered minor repairs. Every time she stood in the shadow of the estate, looking up at its scarred facade, she felt the futility pressing down on her. Still, she could not abandon it. The words of Eleanor's will echoed in her mind. Preserve it. Do not sell it. And beneath those words, Clarissa felt something deeper, an obligation born not of law, but of the strange bond she had formed with the woman in her final days. Her children did what they could. Her son, lanky and still growing into his frame, carried wood planks, swept rubble from the halls, and helped patch what little could be salvaged without professional help. Her daughter, too young for heavy labor, moved carefully through the rooms gathering broken glass, sorting nails and screws, or sweeping small corners. It was meager work compared to the mountain of restoration that loomed ahead, but it gave them all a sense of shared struggle. The house no longer seemed entirely hers alone. It had become something the three of them fought for together, a cause binding their small family in unexpected ways. But not everyone shared their vision. Eleanor's children, Celia and Vincent, launched their campaign almost immediately. They saw Clarissa not as the rightful heir to their mother's legacy, but as an intruder who had stolen what belonged to them. Court papers arrived at Clarissa's door, accusing her of manipulation, alleging that she had preyed upon a dying woman's vulnerability. Whispers spread through town that she had seduced the old woman with false kindness, angling for her fortune. Clarissa tried to shield her children from the gossip, but it seeped into every corner of their lives. At the market, in church, at school events, she felt the eyes, heard the murmurs. Worse still were the intrusions at the estate itself. Locks were broken, windows shattered, and once, on a stormy night, she found the front gate swinging open, tire tracks fresh in the mud leading to the main entrance. Nothing was stolen, yet the message was clear. She was being watched, her resolve tested. The sense of violation gnawed at her. It was not just about inheritance anymore. It was about intimidation, about power. The Winters children were determined to scare her away. But Clarissa's pride and sense of justice grew harder the more they tried to break her. It was then that a voice from the past reached out. Ethel, a frail but sharp-eyed woman who lived nearby and had once worked in the Winters household as a maid, came to the estate and offered her support. She told Clarissa that Eleanor had always spoken highly of her, even before the will. Eleanor had grown weary of her children's greed, Ethel said, and had long feared that the moment she passed, they would strip the house of everything it held dear. Ethel remembered whispers of hidden rooms, sealed documents, and Eleanor's private obsession with preserving truths that her late husband and his partners had tried to bury. Clarissa listened intently, the pieces aligning with the strange discovery of the sealed metal door. The thought that Eleanor had trusted her with more than bricks and mortar became undeniable. The more Clarissa explored the house, the more its history bled into the present. She found old letters, tucked into drawers and hidden behind picture frames, where Eleanor had scribbled her frustrations and suspicions. There were receipts of unusual financial transactions, notes on meetings between her husband and powerful associates, and brief, bitter remarks about betrayal and silence. Slowly, Clarissa began to understand that the Winters fortune had not been built solely on industry and opportunity, but also on corruption, intimidation, and secrets that had stained the very foundations of the house. It was one afternoon, while clearing debris in the East Wing with a small crew of workers she had managed to hire for a day, that they uncovered part of the truth. The metal door she had found earlier became the center of their attention. The workers pried away the charred beams and broken plaster that had half buried it. Rust flaked away under their tools, revealing the solidity of the bolts. With much effort, they forced it open. The door groaned, as if reluctant to yield after so many decades, and behind it lay a chamber sealed off from the world since 1952. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and age, but within, rows of boxes and crates waited, stacked carefully, as though prepared for someone who would one day find them. Clarissa stepped inside, her heart pounding. She opened one box after another, her hands trembling as she revealed ledgers filled with transactions, implicating not just Eleanor's husband, but an entire network of powerful men. There were photographs, yellowed but clear, showing meetings held in secret. There were audio recordings on reels, their labels marked with dates and names. It was not merely a cache of memories. It was an archive of corruption, evidence preserved by Eleanor at great personal risk. The weight of what she had uncovered was staggering. Clarissa realized that this was why Eleanor had left the estate to her, not to her children. The house itself was a fortress built to safeguard truth. The fire that had destroyed part of the wing was no accident. It had been an attempt to erase what was hidden behind that door. Someone had wanted the past to burn, And when it did not, they had waited, hoping that time itself would finish the work. Eleanor, however, had ensured that the archive would survive her, entrusting it to someone outside the family who could be trusted not to betray it. Word of the discovery, however, did not remain secret for long. Clarissa noticed new tire tracks near the gates, new attempts to break in. The documents were too dangerous, their implications too vast. Celia and Vincent must have learned of what she had found, and they would not stop until it was destroyed. Every creak of the house at night set her nerves on edge. She imagined intruders slipping through the broken windows, flames rising again, shadows moving in the halls. The estate had become more than a ruin. It was now a battlefield, and she stood at the center of it, defending both the physical structure and the legacy of truth buried within its walls. As the waves thundered against the cliffs below, Clarissa resolved that she could not retreat. She would not allow intimidation or poverty or threats to erase what Eleanor had fought to preserve. The house had chosen her, or rather, Eleanor had chosen her for the house. And though fear clung to her, she began to feel within herself a new strength, an iron determination that mirrored the bolts of the door she had pried open. The struggle was far from over. In truth, it had only just begun. The discovery of the hidden archive marked a turning point for Clarissa. Until then, the estate had seemed like a decaying monument she had been sentenced to care for, a ruin tethered to her by Eleanor's will and her own conscience. But now it was no longer only a house. It was a vault of voices, of undeniable evidence that could change the story of the Winters family, and perhaps the very history of the town. She felt the weight of it pressing down on her shoulders. Every box, every reel of tape, every faded photograph carried within it secrets that powerful people would rather leave buried. She could not deny the fear that came with holding such knowledge, but alongside that fear was a new and unyielding sense of responsibility. It was clear to her that Eleanor had not trusted her children with this burden because they would have destroyed it. She had trusted Clarissa because she believed Clarissa would protect it, no matter the cost. The days that followed were filled with tension that seemed to thicken the very air around the house. Clarissa began working with a quiet urgency, cataloging the materials, dusting off boxes, and arranging them in safer order. Her children watched with curiosity, but also with unease, sensing that what lay within those crates was dangerous. At night, Clarissa lay awake, her mind replaying the footsteps she thought she heard on the gravel outside, the faint echo of tires on the road below, the distant bark of a dog silenced too quickly. She knew Vincent and Celia would not let this rest. They had already tried to discredit her, already tried to frighten her away. The revelation that the estate held something truly valuable, something beyond mere land or walls, would only fuel their desperation. It did not take long for the pressure to mount. Papers arrived again, this time not only contesting the will, but demanding the immediate surrender of the estate into responsible hands. Vincent appeared outside the gates one afternoon, his car sleek and black against the wild growth of weeds along the driveway. He stood at the iron bars and shouted her name, his voice sharp with fury. She refused to go down and meet him, watching from a high window instead. His gestures were violent, his face twisted with the rage of entitlement denied. She felt a shiver run through her, but did not move. Eventually, he drove away, tires screeching on the gravel, leaving behind a cloud of dust that clung to the air long after he was gone. Clarissa realized she could not protect the house and the archive on her own. She needed allies, people who could both help preserve the materials and shield them from destruction. Reluctantly, she reached out to a local journalist she had met once through the hospice, a man known for his stubborn insistence on truth, even when it cost him dearly. She invited him to the estate under the cover of evening, and together they descended into the hidden room. He examined the boxes with careful reverence, his eyes widening as he recognized the magnitude of what lay before him. He promised to help her bring the truth to light, to ensure that the archive would not be lost to fire or intimidation. For the first time, Clarissa felt the faint stirrings of hope that she was not entirely alone in this fight. The journalist introduced her to a group of historians from a nearby university who specialized in uncovering local histories long buried. They, too, came to the house, treading softly through its ruined halls, and when they saw the archive, they reacted with awe and gravity. They confirmed what Clarissa had already suspected. These documents could alter the legacy of some of the region's most respected families. Records of bribes, records of stolen land, evidence of silenced voices, all lay there, preserved in dusty boxes, sealed away for decades. The historians spoke of grants, of preservation funds, of ways to turn the estate into a place where the truth could be studied and remembered. For Clarissa, the possibility was dizzying. The idea that this ruined house could one day be filled with people seeking knowledge instead of vultures seeking wealth transformed her vision of the future. But her enemies did not relent. Celia and Vincent hired lawyers to block any public disclosure of the materials. They attempted to smear Clarissa in the press, portraying her as a thief of legacies, a manipulator unfit to be trusted with history. Rumors swirled, and for a time it seemed as though public opinion might turn against her. Yet when the journalist published the first article revealing a fraction of the archive's contents, the tide shifted. Ordinary people, long suspicious of the untouchable families who had controlled their town for generations, were galvanized. Letters poured in. Donations trickled to Clarissa's cause, and soon she found herself not isolated, but supported by a growing community that wanted to see the estate preserved as a place of truth. Vincent grew more reckless in his fury. Late one night, Clarissa awoke to the acrid smell of smoke. She rushed to the eastern wing and found a pile of debris burning against the base of the house. The fire had not yet spread, but the intent was unmistakable. Someone had tried again to burn the archive into ash. The fire department came quickly, but the memory of those flames seared into her mind. It was no accident, no coincidence. It was deliberate. And though no names were spoken, everyone knew who would benefit most from the destruction. In the aftermath, investigators uncovered evidence that implicated Vincent directly. His rage had driven him past caution, and he was caught in the web of his own recklessness. When charges were brought against him, Celia turned on her brother, offering cooperation in exchange for her own immunity. Their unity shattered, their power waned, and Clarissa saw for the first time the possibility that the Winters family no longer had the strength to crush her. With the immediate threat diminished, Clarissa turned her attention fully to the restoration of the house. The grants promised by the historians began to take form, and donations from ordinary citizens flowed in with letters of encouragement. Teams of workers arrived, scaffolding rose against the scorched walls, and the ruin began, slowly and painfully, to return to life. Roofs were repaired, windows replaced, gardens cleared of weeds. The air inside grew lighter as soot was scrubbed away, revealing glimpses of the elegance Eleanor had once described to her in the hospice. Where once the house had seemed to sigh under the weight of silence, it now resonated with the sounds of labor, of renewal, of purpose. As the restoration progressed, Clarissa herself changed. She had begun this journey as a weary nurse, burdened with debts and the endless grind of survival. Now she carried herself with the quiet authority of a woman who had faced down the scorn of the wealthy, the weight of history, and the threat of violence, and had not yielded. Her children looked at her with new eyes, pride shining through their exhaustion. They had seen her refuse to bow, refused to abandon what was right, and in doing so, she had become a living lesson of resilience. When at last the house was ready to open, it was no longer simply the Winters estate. It had become something greater. The grand halls that had once echoed with emptiness now filled with the murmur of visitors, students, scholars, townsfolk who came to see the archive, to hear the stories long suppressed, to understand how power had been wielded and misused. The estate was renamed the House of Truth, a place not of vanity but of remembrance, dedicated to preserving the voices Eleanor had sought to protect and to honoring the courage it took to bring them into the light. On the evening of the opening, Clarissa stood on the restored balcony overlooking the sea. The sky was streaked with the orange and violet of sunset, the ocean below roaring as it had for centuries, indifferent to human struggle. Lights glowed in the windows behind her, and the laughter and voices of guests drifted out to meet the night air. She closed her eyes for a moment and felt the presence of Eleanor, not as a ghost, but as a memory, a steady hand on her shoulder, guiding her to this moment. The journey had nearly broken her, but it had also remade her. The house, once a ruin, now stood as a fortress of truth. And she, once a weary woman surviving from paycheck to paycheck, now stood as its guardian. As she opened her eyes and gazed out over the darkening horizon, she understood with absolute clarity that this was no longer someone else's legacy. It was hers, bound to her, not by wealth or law, but by the unshakable bond of trust and the unyielding will to preserve what mattered most. And so the house endured, not as a monument to riches or power, but as a beacon of memory and justice, its walls whispering to all who entered that truth, no matter how long suppressed, could never truly be silenced. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are many more stories worth discovering. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some journeys are too meaningful to keep to yourself.